Hello, I'm a professional game designer and this is Game Design Review, where we look deep into gameplay and dive into both good and bad design, hopefully learning a thing or two in the process. In this video, we will be reviewing game design in Cosmoteer, so let's start by talking about how the game works and what design systems are at play. The game calls itself Starship Architect and Commander, and is about building and fighting with starships. It makes an interesting choice of having every piece of your ship supplied by crew members. That includes carrying power from reactors to the ship systems, ammo to guns, and even assembling rockets inside rocket launchers. At the same time, crew is the main limiter on the player progression. This forces players to make constant trade-offs when designing the ships. For example, placing a reactor inside your weapons area will make your ship more efficient because the crew will have to travel shorter distances, but also more vulnerable to attacks. One lucky shot can blow up a quarter of your ship. On the other hand, choosing a safer place means more supply time and more crew needed to carry the power. These kind of limitations made me really interested in the first place. There's a common misconception that the more freedom you have, the more creative you are. This is not true. Human brain is more creative when it is forced to work around problems, and Cosmoteer carefully chooses the exact problems that will make you a more creative ship designer. You can see that looking at the player-designed ships on the Steam Workshop. They definitely stand out from similar games. I played a lot of space games, but I always end up designing dumb-looking bricks and calling them efficient platforms in brutalistic fashion. Here, I had reasons to experiment with the layout of the entire ship, so I ended up designing ships that actually look fine, at least by my standards. But ship design is not the only part. Players can get resources, either by defeating enemies, trading in shops, or mining and refining from asteroids. Resources are then used to expand and repair your ship. There is also combat. In each sector, quests direct you to places where you have an enemy to defeat. These are divided into different difficulties, so you can choose the order in which you face them. My biggest criticism at this point was the UI, which wasn't very intuitive. Best example is saving attack defaults of a ship, a distance to target which your ship will try to maintain. This setting is hidden in an obscure menu. I watched a Let's Play series and there was a lot of stuff like this that the player only found out because of people in the comments. Besides the UI, everything else in the game seemed very well designed. That made it all the more surprising when I found myself bored around mid-game, where my ship was around 60 to 80 crew. I played another session, this time focusing my attention on how I felt during various phases of the game loop. First thing I noticed is that I was way more excited for a redesign of a ship than for actual combat. From that, I saw the game through a unique lens. In most games with fighting and upgrading, gameplay would be defined as fighting first, then upgrading between fights, to have more fun during the next fight. This means that the upgrading plays a supporting role for combat. Cosmoteer can be viewed and analyzed in that way, however, I believe it misses a core player fantasy of Cosmoteer, which is the focus on designing. So let's switch the point of view and put the design phase as the core and combat phase as the supporting one. First of all, the design phase needs a problem for the player to solve. This is either set up by the player's imagination, for example, I want to add a big laser, or a problem diagnosed by the player in the combat phase, for example, I need more damage per second at the long range. This is then faced off against constraints the player has, which is crew and resources. Then the player solves puzzles that have emerged from these needs and limitations. These work great. Next, let's describe the combat phase. In order to properly support the design phase, players' goal during combat is to evaluate the ship design and find problems with the ship that can be improved. For example, that there are too few crew members supplying power to a laser. Describing the game like that uncovered a problem. When the enemy is weak, you can see your ship in action, but your design isn't put to the test. However, when the enemy is strong, the player has to put more attention into winning the engagement and cannot focus on diagnosing his ship. This makes evaluating your ship a hard task. This is especially hard if the player is not totally aware of this goal during the combat, so he doesn't pause to see if systems are supplied correctly or check why there are no crew in the lasers. He can still do that, it is just very unintuitive to check that during combat. Let's call that valuable feedback problem. Admittedly, I don't see an easy solution for that. The obvious first step that comes to mind is a system that would allow players to review what worked and what didn't. The issue here is how to show that without damaging the game pacing and not overwhelm the player with useless information. Even if reading detailed logs is something that some players would appreciate, for an average player, it would be very boring. I've noticed how the Let's Player I've watched actually had a lot of good insights about combat performance of his ships. My theory is that it was the result of recording and reviewing his gameplay between the videos while he was editing them. This might suggest a replay system, but I don't think this would be a good idea. Replay systems are notoriously underused, and there is no reason to think that they would be used here. Some players probably would, but it's a solution only for a select few. The next possible fix is to collect some statistics about systems during combat that would be available to see in the design phase. Something like this laser spent 70% of the time firing, 20% of the time waiting for ammo, and 10% waiting for crew. These could give players enough of a hint into what went wrong and allow them to enter the redesign phase with slightly better defined goals. This raises the same issue, however: how to present that information so that the player can easily grasp the nature of the problem without needing a spreadsheet and an engineering degree. The game calls itself Starship Architect, but it shouldn't require you to have an actual degree. A last change that might help is increasing time to kill by either reducing the weapon's damage or increasing HP of ship parts, so there is more time to see systems working and failing in even fairly easy combats, with big combats giving a lot more time to spot issues and hopefully giving the player some valuable insights. This can, however, harm the game pacing. So I played some more to see that specific problem in action, and there I encountered another issue. The quality of the feedback from combat wasn't the only problem. It was also rare for me to get into combat in which valuable feedback could be gathered. Basically, I designed my ship to deal damage from long range and be maneuverable enough not to get into enemy weapons range. In other words, I created a design that avoids taking damage and at the same time avoids the feedback function of the combat phase, which means I don't have small goals for the design phase, which was most likely the reason for the boredom mid-game. There's a great quote from the makers of Civilization: "Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of the game." And I think that is what happened. So why was my ship designed that way? I think the soundest reason is in the limitations that are placed on the player in the design phase, mainly the resource limitation. Since taking damage forces you to repair, having a ship that takes damage means you get less resources for expanding. This pushes the player to design ships that take no damage, but no damage means less feedback, which damages the core gameplay. Let's call that the damage incentives problem. Here, I noticed there are a lot of mechanics that seem to address that issue in the game, like repairs directly from the wreckage, very limited shielding, or the way missiles can rotate and hit you from the back. This leads me to believe that developers are aware of this issue and are trying out different things to address that. The damage incentives problem can be tackled in few ways. Most of them are based on reducing the penalty for taking damage. This can be done by reducing the cost of repair or allowing ships to repair in combat via some kind of repair system. However, a much harder problem is teaching the player to choose to engage in more risky fights and be willing to lose a quarter of the ship in combat. Avoiding harm is a very strong instinct in players, and fighting that is difficult and may even be pointless. One controversial way to address that would be to take away this choice instead of allowing the player to choose incorrectly. A way to do that is limiting these choices to a semi-linear difficulty seen for example in FTL, or scaling difficulty based on player strength. But these systems are often hated by players because they break the illusion of control the player has. That's a difficult problem and I don't have a good solution here. If you have some ideas, put them in the comments, and if you want more reviews like this, subscribe. Also, check out Cosmoteer. The link to the Steam page is in the description below. Thanks.